Okay, welcome back to our first panel. Just a couple of admin notes. If you haven't been with us before for one of these panels, everyone should have a notepad and a pen at your place. We just ask that when we get through initial opening comments on the panel, when we get to the Q&A session, if you have something you would like the moderator to ask the panelists, go ahead and write that question on those notepads that are in front of you. Hold up the notepad. We'll have people coming around to grab the questions and bring them up to the moderator, and he'll ask the panelists the questions and directing it. You can either direct it to a specific panelist if you have something particular you want to ask them, or you can go ahead and address it to the panel however you want to address your question. So let me go ahead and start with the first introduction. Our first panel host this morning is the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the Air Force. He supports 20,000 cyber operations and support personnel with a portfolio value of around $17 billion. He oversees the Air Force's information and technology portfolio, which covers everything from networks to cloud computing, enterprise policies, information resources management, IT innovation initiatives, and he integrates the Air Force warfighting and mission support capabilities, networking and securing airspace and terrestrial assets. He also leads career management for 10,000 cyber professionals and across all human resources facets. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. William E. Marion.
How's everybody doing? All right, hopefully we get a little continuation of General Wegman's speech. I always love to hear him speak. Great visionary in the cyber world. Oh, he's right. Oh, he didn't pay me to say that, I promise that. But hopefully continue that theme. Esteemed panel here today, and so I'm going to do a short introduction to them, but we're going to get at it and hopefully push some envelopes with respect to what's working, what's not working. What does IT look like? How are we going to shift our cyber defense and cyber offense paradigms, and how we look at even privacy and confidentiality, those kind of things. So we're going to run the whole gamut here today. We've got a good amount of time to talk through, so we'll do some Q&A at the end and go through that. But on my left here, Milo Medin at Google. I'm going to call all of these by a call sign. So he's the wireless guy. He's the network guy. So huge history in this space. Across the commercial spectrum, driving all the way now into the 5G and next kind of paradigms, and driving evolution at scale and speed. And so when you talk IoT, you think next-gen networking, Milo's the guy, and he's going to bring a lot of those dimensions today. The app guy, I call Chris the app guy, right? Former DDS, now rebellion, disruption kind of stuff, but the thing I love about him, right, is if you look at his bio, Pat Shanahan said his famous call sign is, let's just get shit done, right? I mean, you come into the Pentagon, it's like, let's get something done. Let's move the ball. The adversary's catching up with us. And so huge amount of time doing some great things at DDS, now off in his own firm. So he's going to bring a lot of those dimensions, containerization, cloud, big push within JEDI and all the cloud work there. Scott Hewitt, I've gotten to know him over the last year and a half, I guess, former MGM CISO, so I call him the anti-criminal guy. So needless to say, he's got a lot of fun in the MGM space, in cyber defense and criminal activity and all those kind of things, but also a native Texan, so I love that about him as well. UT, right? The University of Texas, go Horns, right, whatever it is. Great history, great work at MGM, now out with Senior Vice President at McAfee. And in the end, Junaid Islam, Vitter, I guess Verizon acquired Vitter. He's the network perimeter guy, but not the old network perimeter guy. He's the new network perimeter guy. What does software-defined look in this space? A lot of work in quantum, a lot of work in, how do we reimagine what the network perimeter looks like? So the journey today, as we go through, that's a short introduction, won't give it due justice here, but great talent up here. Again, we're going to push a little bit of the envelope. We also gave a spectrum of attire, so we have everything from the suit to the Rebel Alliance here with us today, so we're going to cover the gamut with respect to tech and defense as well. And so with that, I'm going to sit down and we'll just get at it. But Milo, we'll start with you, because I think the biggest thing, right, is we talk about hyper-connected, AI-enabled, huge data environment. What do you see as kind of the trend that we need to be at 2 to 3 years from now?
I think it's interesting. I'm old. I remember when things weren't connected by default. Now things are connected by default, and in fact, if they're not connected, they keep trying to get connected. So trying to fight that as opposed to manage it is an important change. And I think, you were talking about the discussion about zero trust and network perimeters. A lot of folks remember protecting things. The DoD protects a lot of things. You protect aircraft, you protect crews, you protect weapons. Those are physical things. You think about, if I could put them in a fence and I can protect them, they'll be safe. But bits are not like that. Bits can be copied, and they can just go through things. And so I think that move, where the commercial sector is really already there in many ways, because of the need to protect information as opposed to protecting communications. That is a big shift that I think the department is lagging in significantly. And we need to be thinking about, how do we protect the underlying information as opposed to just the network itself?
Absolutely. I think General Wegeman summed that up really well. It's like the core is really about data. There is no perimeter anymore. So you talk about containerization in cloud, or you talk about, we talked a little bit off stage about identity as a kind of a fundamental concept that we're not really doing very well at the DoD. So I didn't know, Scott or Chris, if you wanted to dive in on that one. But identity seems to be the big monolithic issue that we've got right now as one of the issues that to get it to ZTA.
I'll just maybe make a quick comment here. One of the things that I noticed quite a bit when I was with the department and running Defense Digital Services, that it is not lost on you when you go out to all these different places around the world and you have a CAC card, which is supposed to uniquely identify me, and you cannot get access to a terminal someplace else. And it doesn't make any sense, right? So identity is one of these things that is so core to all the operations within how defense runs. And Milo was just talking about, hey, we've got all these changes where we're very good at protecting physical assets, but a huge portion of where the department over time needs to go is that we understand who is taking what action across the network and across all the different systems that are being used upon it and consumed. And when you don't have that, it actually creates massive gaps that are almost impossible sometimes to actually look into and see what's going on, which is actually maybe I want to be the anti-criminal guy, but maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, we provided it, in the commercial space as a service. So we created an API. We said, hey, this is how you register it. Here's how you connect to it, and we made it go fast. And so what we saw is actually more people came on board quicker than the old days of, oh, I'm going to write a connector, oh, I'm going to get it up and working, all those things. When we said, hey, if you want to go fast, here's the way you do it, and if you want to go slow, here, let me park you over here, and you're not going to go as fast. And we found the users demanding the application space to come on board with those type of things. And then you can add things like multi-factor or biometric or whatever, because you're only doing it in one spot instead of a bunch of different spots across the organization. And two, we were leaning very heavily into, it used to be like facial and all that wasn't real practical because of the compute needed, but now there's so much cloud, compute that they can offer that we were, if you think about when a casino goes off shift, you've got 2,000 people coming in your building, right? And they're all holding up cards, and even I've forgotten my badge sometimes. I just hold up the business card and the guard doesn't really look, right? And so what it does instead is with the facial recognition, it's looking at 1,000 people and said, hey, check the badge on that person. I haven't seen them before. And it's a whole new paradigm of how it works. And like I said, identity is super hard, and it's one of the last things we like to lean into because it's not sexy, but it's the most important thing that we do in security.
And so taking that next side, so you got identity as a core piece, and then reimagining what the network looks like. And so, Junaid, I was going to go to you. A lot of history in the Fed space with MPLS and MLPP and a lot of those security standards and how we secured and delivered agile networks. What do you see a year, 2, 3 years down the line with what the network looks like and the impacts with respect to just, we talk about joint all-domain operations. How do we enable joint all-domain operations through that next-gen network?
Well, I think we're in an exciting period for operational effectiveness that is truly game-changing, and I think everybody in this room is involved, which is fantastic. I think, though, I've been involved in protocol design now for 30 years, and the thing I'd share with everybody in the group is that security cannot be an afterthought. As we build these global multi-domain networks, we have to think about how identity is handled within the fabric. The other thing we all have to think about as a group, I put us all on the same team, is countermeasures to newer types of attacks like quantum computing attacks. So we have the burden of not only solving new attacks where we're not exactly sure what the attack is, but still solving older attacks, because the enemy is still going to use phishing, and they're still going to steal your laptop, and they're going to steal your phone. None of that is going away, right? And this, I think, really will require the Air Force to have a new relationship with the vendors. The complexity of the problem is way too high that we can't solve it through an RFP or an RFI. I mean, it's got to be a collaboration, and but I think there's an opportunity to do it right. And one of the things we're doing at Verizon, which is new for us, is we're creating test beds that will allow the security team, the counterintelligence team, to actually interact directly with our test beds and model attacks and countermeasures. And I think I think this is something we all need to do as an industry because of the risk, and the risk is truly national security.
And maybe this is a tie back to Milo. I mean, you talk about cloud and next-gen networks, and that model around cybersecurity is certainly changing before our eyes, right? And the work the Air Force is doing in the DevSecOps and containerized applications and put them in cloud. But kind of where do you see that environment? What do you think are the big changes, or I'll call it shortfalls inside the DoD that we really need to tackle over the next couple of years?
Well, I mean, the organizational structure in DoD around IT is just a disaster, right? You've got DISA, you've got the CIO, you've got the services.
Hey, that was not the Air Force CIO, right?
Yeah.
I'll with that.
That's right. But let's face it, no corporation would ever organize their IT resources the way you guys do. And by the way, no corporation could ever pass a Sarbanes-Oxley risk statement with the architecture that you guys have. So, I've heard people say, the DoD is very risk averse, all the rest of that. You guys take so many risks, that compared to what we do. Like, I go to, how many command posts have you been in lately where you've seen Windows XP, right? Windows XP is the venereal disease of the Department of Defense. It's known not to be secure, it's known obsolete, it's not supported by the vendor anymore, but it's marbled through your systems, right? So that model of thinking that it's safe to stay the same, right? Software ages poorly, right? Fighter pilots, how many of you here been a fighter pilot or been a fighter pilot, right? Don't you have a saying, speed is life? Staying still kills you. And that's where I think that model, that if you ask me, the biggest cultural and organizational change has to be, we can't move slowly the way we used to, right? Because the threat environment has changed. And I think the other dynamic is, the assumption that all your bad actors are on the outside and somehow the people on the inside are safe. I don't think that works anymore either. So the model of basically saying, I don't trust any network. The network may be a signal that lets me know where gives me more information about where the conversation is trying to happen. But the network can't be a key. So the network is a signal, it's not a key. And what does that mean? So if folks here are working on JADC2 or NC3, I would issue a personal challenge to you. Think about how you structure the software and communications on those systems, assuming they were all connected to the internet. Not that you should connect them, but assume that there's full connectivity to the outside world. And now design your components in a way that assumes that. Because if you do that, if you've got bad folks who get inside your network or are trying to masquerade, you're going to all be prepared to deal with that. Trying to retrofit that, as Janae said, I think that's going to be really hard.
Faulty model.
Can I just add on to that? I think that it's really important to not believe that the pristine design of anything that you create as far as a network will endure.
Yes.
Assume it will not. You should assume that anything in the world that you have, no matter how exotic or unique or important it is, may suffer from the unintended consequence of evolving around the network and the mission around it. And I'll say it a little bit more simply. You should assume that anything could be connected to the internet,
right,
and you don't know. What I have seen over and over, we started a program years ago called Hack the Pentagon. And it was really funny because at the beginning we started working on this thing and you know, it seemed very innocuous, right? But what we ended up just finding over and over is that we could get and identify pathways from the internet onto internal department networks. Now, that's interesting, right? Well, what happens as people get really good at moving around networks, right? I think that you should assume, as Milo said, do not trust the network. Do not assume that a hard outer shell and a soft gooey inside is something that is going to protect you. It won't protect you. It doesn't protect you, right? Those are really important things. And then I have seen over and over and over the complete and total change of the security posture on a network in order to meet operational and mission needs. And things just get connected to the internet somehow by accident, just because. And it's not by malice and it's not by bad intent. It will happen. So you have to design these things that they live in a world in which tomorrow we might find a vulnerability that is actually so critical in a system that we designed the day before that seemed perfectly safe. And we need to be able to address that like that. And if you can't do that, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. It's the world that we live in today, and it is absolutely the case.
And I would just piggyback on one thing. Imagine you build a network and you don't have this principle involved. It's wartime. You discover the bad guys are in your system, and now the choice is, do I shut the network off and deprive my ability to communicate, right? Or operate and know that the bad guys can get at your information. You do not want to be in that position.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd like to pivot over to Scott for a second. So that, kind of from your industry time at MGM, if you could, and within those paradigms, how do you shift also in that? I mean, your adversaries were shifting every single day on you as well, but you also have a very large commercial sector you're trying to protect. How do you balance the compliance piece of being in the gaming industry and the
I think what's hard is the compliance piece actually sometimes leads you to false security models, right? Oh, I'm going to satisfy the compliance, and it's like, guess what? Compliance is always 5 or 6 years behind where the actual security model should be. And so I felt like I spent half my time educating the Gaming Bureau on like, I get what you want me to do, and I'll do it, but like I need to start thinking about this. And you know, I guess the best example I would give is it's a personnel change too, because it's back to, you know, to date myself, I remember when I was a CTO at a .com and we were trying to sell the idea of job postings on the internet, right? And people are like, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. And you would go into a network and say, yeah, you have to have network connectivity, internet connectivity to upload the jobs. And like 90% of the companies were like, we're never going to connect to the internet, right? And again, it's like a paradigm of like, oh my God, like how could people really think that was true? But they did. And so the example I would give you of the shift that we made at MGM is the first time we built our cloud instance in Azure, we built it in a very traditional method of tossing emails over the wall and using a project manager and all that. It took us about 5.5 months to build it. And I would say within about a month and a half, an S3 bucket went missing. Luckily, it wasn't an important S3 bucket, but it was like, holy cow. And so then suddenly, like, you're rethinking the whole thing. And we did. We pulled together a DevOps team, and in 5 weeks, We rebuilt the entire Azure environment, totally zero trust in the production environment, totally automated the CI/CD pipeline. It was 1,000 times better, but it was the first time that people ever thought of like, hey, we're gonna have a security person in the room, we're gonna have the business user in the room, you know, like that was just not a thought process we had. And so, you know, you have to constantly be retraining your workforce to think in new ways.
Absolutely. And so, Junaid, I know you're doing a lot of work in software-defined perimeter, and how do you take these models between cloud and mobile and this hyper-connected space? So what do you see in that investment area that the DoD ought to be looking at over the next year or two?
So I think the DoD has taken an approach to incorporate zero trust architectures, and I think that's actually a fantastic thing. That is actually a long time coming. No, to date myself and others in the room, zero trust is actually not a new concept. It was actually a part of net-centric warfare, and I was a contractor in net-centric warfare, and then it got shut down, which was a mistake on many dimensions. It's good to see that after 16 years, we've restarted that as a part of zero trust. And to me, the whole point of zero trust is the network fabric is an active element, that it's not passive. I think the mistake we made over the past decade is we treated the network as a pipe and we implemented security on edge systems. That is so dangerous, as everybody on this panel has pointed out, because if you get infiltrated inside your network, you're highly vulnerable. So now we're moving to the state where the network will verify who you are, what your mission is, and then route you to the correct place. This is something that, again, was a part of the original net-centric warfare. If you guys remember, the older people, the black cloud architecture, the black cloud would present a different version of the network based on your mission and role. And we're now doing that. So I think it's really critical that thinking comes into our process. And there's a reason why. The word hacker, I think, is the wrong word. We're using the word hacker and cyber attack is a decade old. And in our minds, we have this notion of a kid or whatever. We are now fighting governments. And governments can do things that hackers can't do. A government can buy your supplier. And this is happening all the time. A government can buy a satellite constellation, right? So the level at which a government can attack the United States is so much more stronger than a hacker. You know, to use the same word, I almost feel like we as a team should come up with a different word to make it clear we're fighting a government who has billions of dollars. And I think the only way to do that is to have countermeasures to state-sponsored attacks built into the fabric, which includes supply chain. A government can do something like they can buy every vendor in the world that is supplying us and drive them bankrupt so that they become the only vendor. This is a new kind of chessboard that we have to calibrate our thinking to, and it's very critical. And it's hard, but.
Yeah, I want to dig into countermeasures. So we talk about proactive defense, and is that offense or is that defense? But I'll leave this open to anyone that wants to jump in. I mean, what does countermeasures look to you? We don't really use that word very often, but I think it is a very germane term, especially as industry gets more and more front and dead center of even the nation state threats. Right, so I was just wondering what your perspective is on where the goodness is in countermeasures and how we might use them within the letters of the law, because there's certainly some parameters there.
I mean, I think from the commercial perspective, part of it is how quickly are you reacting to attacks? Can you automate that process, right? So at Google, we use machine learning and AI to develop sort of normal patterns of life for our network. When we see really changes, right, that can trigger automated responses to either shunt traffic, right, cut it off. The perimeter we have as a company is very large. And so we, a long time ago, realized we couldn't hire enough people to protect it effectively. We had to build tools that automated that, and it improved our time to react significantly, because you're not going through a whole chain of individuals, right? On the offensive side, you know, I think there's a lot of work going on. Obviously, the civilian space we're not legally authorized to do that thing. On the other hand, I think the pace of machine learning and AI in terms of offense is also something that we're all going to have to deal with, because I think you're going to see that role expand over the next few years as well in ways that I think are going to be challenging.
So Chris, would you mind doubling down from a cloud perspective where you see that term in the cloud space? I think.
Yeah. So, this is one of the things that I think about a lot. When we were envisioning this thing that would have been eventually be called Jedi Cloud, one of the things that we started with was this idea of, hey, we wanted to have a capability, have it run anywhere on any network, any classification around the world on mission, right? Something that I think that I would hope that the majority of people in this room would say is very, very hard today. Yes, there are ways to do it, but it is very hard. And we wanted the amount of time to be able to do that to be very small. So imagine that one of you created a new capability, you sat down and wrote a piece of code, and you wanted to go ahead and deploy it. What does that take today? What do you have to do? You have to go buy hardware, you have to go buy, find a place to put servers in, and maybe it's at DISA, maybe it's at who knows where it is, but all of those things take time. Then we have to go through this arduous ATO process. Well, all of those things, and going back down to when you think about countermeasures, like how do we become better? Blow all that stuff up, because it actually is a very, it's a huge inhibitor to be able to operate as fast as you can. Now, there are things in which somebody out there is going to be saying, yeah, but we deal with this, and this should take more time because of the severity of the things that we're working with. I want to be very clear about what I'm saying. I didn't say be careless or reckless. Never said that. We should be absolutely as good as we can, but in order to do these things, we should have a system that we can, or a platform that we can deploy to. That is where a system like Jedi comes in, right? Is that we can create capabilities, we can put it into a system that'll automatically run through ATOs. That'll look at compliance, and by the way, compliance does not save anybody, but it does provide a little bit of assurance that at least the basic check boxes have been checked. And it does give us an ability to accelerate to get to the places that we need to be. I think that that's incredibly important. I'll add one other thing that I think I spent a lot of time, both at Rebellion, which we started up last year, but at DDS. Go hire and find the most incredibly smart, current, technical people who know, live, and breathe these technologies, who will self-select into the mission of defense today to help guide decision-making around both policy and activities. If you don't do that, you are relying upon opinion. And opinion isn't really helpful because it's not advice and it's not experience. And I see it all the time. We hire lots of people who have deep, unbelievable experience in intelligence and in regions and all these things, and then somebody will be like, yeah, let's talk about how to write software, and they've never written software yet, and they'll literally convince a whole room as to how that should be done. That doesn't make any sense to me. If I were to be like, hey, SOCOM, put me on a mission and give me a machine gun and let me run around and go on a raid with you, and everybody would be like, that's crazy, you're a nerd, Chris. Absolutely right, I'm a nerd, don't do that. But trust me on the thing that I know how to do. I know how to nerd machine gun, right? So that's the type of stuff that we want to do, and I think that that is a countermeasure. We have to attract and make that talent believe that there is a place for them in national defense, and they need to be at the table.
Yep. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to Scott. One of the things we talked about, one of the things that we liked about what MGM was doing about their tools kind of perspective, how many tools you run. And if you're not familiar, we have the 12 and 12 initiative with 16th Air Force and ACC, which is looking holistically about all of these tools, right? Some of us would argue we've crushed the souls of our airmen. I know our chief talks about that pretty regularly, about so many tools on top of tools. Now we have so many countermeasures that we actually countermeasure it ourselves, and we can't actually operate. Scott, I know you've had a lot of experience with this over the years, and almost evangelistic about what tools you have and how well your operators are trained to work that with deadly precision. If you wouldn't mind kind of, I think that's a very germane topic right now, given where the DoD is, and even more specifically the Air Force is, with number of tools, and how do you operationalize them and make sure they're serving the needs of the airmen?
Yeah, when I came into MGM Resorts, we had 57 different security tools. And so, and I remember walking in, it's like, oh, this is super cool because it's a casino, so they got to have great security and all that. And like, I was getting blown up every night. Like, oh, we had this ransomware attack. And it's like, how do we have 57 tools? And like, I'm never sleeping all the way through at night, right? and so as I started to look at it, it was like every problem that popped up, they just, instead of going like, well, let's in depth figure out how that got into our environment, there'd be like, oh, there's a new tool for that. So what I did is, it's like, you know, I guess this was what's been helpful is I was a CIO before I went into security. And it's like, security is a platform, you know, and the people that operate it are what make it important. So we took it down to about 4 key security vendors, and then, you know, 6 or 7 other tools. But if you look at the big security vendors, they hit almost every space, right? And so it was like, hey, if you need a new tool and one of these guys don't provide it, that's fine, but you need to come see me if one of these guys provide it. And so what we saw over the years is, number one, our mean time to detection and response got much quicker, and we were catching the attacks way further up the kill chain than we were before, because they actually got really good at the tools they were using. And so what you see all the time is, oh, you know, EDR came out, and this vendor is the best at EDR, so here, let me go do that. And it's like, okay, the other vendor has EDR too, and by the time you figure out how to use it, the efficacy of the tool will catch up. They always do, right? So, you know, I would lean to 2 next generation endpoint detection products that were the best thing ever 3 years ago, and one has been bought by a chip vendor, and the other one has been bought by a RIM provider, right? And so, like, what do you think the efficacy of those tools are going to do? They're just going to drop down. So we spent a lot of time doing that, and it was very effective. And then I got the 4 key vendors together and said, hey, there's a whole bunch of API to API interaction that you say you have, so I'm going to give you the use case, and you write those API to API connections. And so instead of me having to worry about doing it, we made them do it for us, and the platform became more and more effective as we went along.
Very good. Same kind of shift. I want the quantum discussions that we've had of decryption, encryption, the risk there, and then kind of where we see that market going and where the opportunities are with respect to DoD. I know this is one of your current passions, I think, trying to in your software-defined perimeter.
Yeah.
You mind kind of going into that one?
So at Verizon, we're doing a lot of work on quantum safe communications, as you would expect us to do. It's a very difficult field because part of the challenge is quantum attacks itself is very new. It's actually very theoretical that, you know, what you can do. And one of the interesting things is, you know, Google announced their supercomputer, and it was a random number generator. And a lot of people said, that was a nothing, it's just a random number generator. But for some of us, it was actually a very scary random number generator because it did 10 quadrillion numbers in 200 seconds, and you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, one of the things in brute force attacks is being able to generate numbers very fast. So if you took a quantum computer and you mated it with a supercomputer to basically feed it, and then you had a machine learning engine, you can basically look at terabytes of old cryptography and see if you can find a pattern, which is like really scary. And the threat is just not breaking the message. If they could just figure out that was a US airplane or a satellite, if they could just get the attribution, that alone is lethal for the United States. So this is an area that is very important to us, but I mean, to the comments that were made, we just can't bolt this on to an existing network. It has to be integrated with the other tools. And one of the things that you said that I think is a little bit important, I've been involved in technology a long time, and I'll tell you right now, the most important thing in a technical system is the people. Right. It dwarfs, and the reason is I've had the privilege of working with people in the intelligence community and the defense community who are utterly brilliant. And the thing I got working out of these brilliant people is they could take any system and make it behave like any other system just because they knew so much, right? And I wish I was that smart, but I'm not. So the key thing is just don't keep adding more security. Just don't keep adding more security for cloud, for quantum, because then we end up with a security stack that's unmanageable. What we have to do as a group is really look at the attack vectors, force ourselves to do a clean sheet approach to how would we build a security stack, model that, and then bring up the people side.
And I think, you made an important point, and it was made this morning too, and it's highly undersold in the security field. Diversity is super important. Because, so I asked my team, is everything, we started to see the shift left movement, right? It's like, hey, I had a team of about 50 at MGM. It's like, how many of you guys started off as network engineers? 49, right? I was the only one in the room that had ever been a developer. And it's like, okay, so software-defined networking, containerization, microsegment architecture, like, how are you going to keep up with that? Right? And then two, I would also say the problem is if you stay in security too long, you get this box mindset, right? And so we would look for people in the business who just had a veracity to learn.
Yeah.
And pull them into the group, and I've pulled some from HR, and I pulled in some from, finance or whatever, and it's like just, back to find people that believe in the mission and they want to learn. And I think that's the thing is, it gets undersold. Most people that I know in security, even in the private sector, like I feel like I'm getting paid, nice thing is private dollars to do public good.
Yeah.
I work with law enforcement a lot. It's a really important thing. And so find people that have that passion, but aren't necessarily security guys or computer guys, and pull them into your team because they will see the problem from a different angle than you've ever seen it.
Yeah, and I would just, to piggyback onto that, I think if you think about the workforce, you've got folks, particularly Air Force, has got the most technical set of folks coming into from the bottom up. You get folks, they're motivated, but don't sit them down and give them a Windows 7 machine and make them use SharePoint, right? So the question is, what does industry use? If you want to attract people, so I got married late in life. My pastor said, do you want to get married? If you want to get married, you should try and become the person that the person you want to marry would want to marry, right? So the question is, how does the Air Force become the place that people who want to contribute to the national security of the United States, who are digital natives, that you are the place where they want to come to work?
Absolutely.
How do you make it easy for them? I serve on the Defense Innovation Board. And by the way, all my comments do not represent the DIB, its chairman, or the Secretary of Defense, right? So I just get that out of the way. But one of the things we're talking about is, can you create a career vertical so that you've got people like musicians, lawyers, and doctors, where you've got a career path that doesn't take you out of the skill set that you've been invested in for several years, right? You're squandering expertise. And a lot of these folks, after you give them a taste of being able to actually have effectiveness, and then you transfer them to some other place, well, maybe they're just going to exit the Air Force instead, right? So how does the Air Force become a place where digital natives want to work?
One thing we do, we are taking questions, so I think they're passing around note cards, so not sure how they're going to come up here, but if you haven't written down questions, we will take those, getting close to the point where we're going to start going through some of those pieces, so please let those go in. Although this is a panel, I do want to thematically put in some of the things the Air Force is doing so that kind of catch everybody up. So we talked about security speed. So there is absolutely a reason why the fast track ATO and the continuous ATO concepts are being pushed so hard by myself, Dr. Roper, acquisition community, right? Because it's this fundamental pivot to continuous monitoring, the fundamental pivot to sense and remediate at scale and speed, the pen testing, the third-party assessor, those thematics right? And so the core of fast track and continuous ATO is like in continuous, it's CI/CD pipeline, two-person coding, you're testing as you're going. We've got to get to that level of speed, because I would argue those modern systems are far more secure than most of, probably all of the legacy things. So you come in with the different hypotheses up, but those policies are out there. I will tell you, all the way up to the secretary and the chief, they have been briefed on these things. We have built such a cottage industry around that, that I see it not being fully institutionalized. In fact, some people saying, you got to be compliant, right? That's the grade. You have senior leadership, not just myself, but above me in the glass doors, it's really pushing this speed and agility and security far, far outpaces a compliance checklist. Because if you've heard me talk about this, Wedge knows this, right? SIPRNet modernization, the very thing that's going to make us more secure, there was arguments that it's going to take us 1.5 years to do the ATO. I was like, that's just asinine, right? I mean, those capabilities, we've got to speed to delivery. Again, don't do anything stupid, but deliver that at speed, get that out there, and then we'll tweak in the seams to get it at the 100%.
I would just say process does not trump competence. So it's really important that you've got the people who are technically able to weigh the trade-offs in the room making the decisions. That can't be about just going down the checklist, okay, now I've gotten this done, I'm good.
This is, this is almost always the big point that I hit when I talk about any of these things. I don't care if you're talking about how do we use AI, I don't care if you're talking about how do we use ML, I don't care how you use any of these things. It always comes down to making sure that you have an incredibly current, technical, passionate group that has self-selected into the most important mission that is, and that is the one of national defense, right? Find those people, give them an environment in which they can do their job. That sounds simple. It is oftentimes very hard, right? We put them in places where they may not even get a computer account for a month or two, right? I've seen that. We put them into places where they don't have simple tools to do the things that they need, right? We have to provide them an environment to let them do their job. They have to be passionate. They have to be current. They have to have good experience to make decisions. There is this one other thing, please also, just a little takeaway. You're probably thinking when Milo says Windows XP and Windows 2000, you're probably thinking, hey, we have a security report. I know that that's not good. Check in all your PEOs. Check in all the things. Check in all the programs. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. It's down there. I know because I've seen it pretty recently.
Yeah, and so a couple thematics that I think are important bearing out to go through. So Digital U, if you've heard of that, Digital University, that democratization across, so we normally do, even our tech training, we say, you're in this career field, and if you're not in that career field, we're not even going to train you. Yeah. So a logistician, why do you need data analytics? A personnelist, why do you need data analytics, right? And so the whole concept around Digital University is to democratize that piece. I would argue every airman ought to have some level of data analytics skills. They ought to have some level of cybersecurity skills. So that's one of the things we're investing in. That award is imminent. We'll get that pushed out, but it's the whole democratization of it. The other piece, and this isn't squarely in my lane, but it's definitely in Dr. Roper's lane, under this agile acquisition, right? So you really jumped into this in DDS, of these OTAs and SIBRs and pitch days. And in fact, there's going to be a joint all-domain operations pitch day tomorrow out in LA. This whole, how do you rapidly bring capability in? So if you're not tracking, there is a big strategic message that Dr. Roper is trying to push to bring that agility back into the world's greatest Air Force again, right? To drive that innovation back. To be that kind of Google-esque of like, okay, it may not succeed the first time, but we'll tweak it, we'll make it better, we'll tweak it, we'll make it better. And so all of those aren't just individual acquisitions, they're part of a strategic intent to fundamentally retool. And so don't be lost on that. The other side, and this is to Milo's point on, when we talk EIT, right, delivering the world that an airman wants. So tying in, bring your own device. Tying in actual true cloud native applications, the DevSecOps, CI/CD pipeline applications, right? We're starting to see this fundamental, if you look at the Gartner hype cycle, right, I think we're coming out of the trough of disillusionment and trying to get into that and really starting to get into that slope of enlightenment of these things are becoming real. Cloud one is real. Platform one is real. The data work that we're doing is real. The change in the security paradigms and the policies are real. But we're also not all the way in the slope of enlightenment yet. I mean, there is still some heavy lift that we're trying to push through. And so it's really key that we all kind of rally behind that. Did y'all have anything you wanted to add there? We got some really good questions coming in, so I was going to go through those. All right. So the first one was a follow-up to the talent management from Chris Lynch. Many of us struggling with hiring digital talent in the government. I know you tied in that a lot. Any lessons learned or practical advice from DDS? So really germane question right now. So it's really easy to say, go hire the best and brightest, and then we say, you're at GS12 step 1, knock yourselves out and do this really high-end tech stuff. And
Yeah, so let me just paint the picture of day one when I showed up and started Defense Digital Service. I had no military experience, no government experience. I didn't have an office, didn't have a computer at the Pentagon, and I was wandering the halls aimlessly. So that was sort of day one. That was a very, very lonely place. So the best way to end that loneliness is let's figure out how to hire people and get people on. I think about it in the evolution of what DDS would go through and then learning how to quickly hire and learning how to bring on what would be around, in the 4 years that I ran DDS, around 200 or so different people. And they would come from a wide variety of all the companies that any one of you have probably used their products to run or or participate in some point in your personal lives. How did we do that and how did we look at it? Well, first of all, at the beginning, I think it's about just stealing what you can. And this is the find people who are very, very good and figure out how to steal them. Because here's the thing, they're probably not being utilized in the correct way wherever they are right now, right? Once you have found some of those people, then you need to figure out how to hire. I have news, there are a variety of really great hiring authorities. Shocker, sometimes we don't use them. We should use them. We hired, for Hack the Pentagon, there was I met years ago, I met a 17-year-old who had hacked the Air Force. And his name was Jack Cable, 17 years old. He won, I think, $40,000 in bounties at 17 years old. Well, that's pretty cool, right? I met with Jack, and I said, why do you do this? And he said, I just want to help my country, which I thought was, holy shit, that's a cool answer. I don't know that I would have given that answer when I was 17, but that's a really cool answer. And he sent me an email as he was getting close to graduating high school, and he said, I want to come work at DDS. I want to come work on the mission of defense. How amazing, he's graduating high school. Okay, cool, so we sent in a hiring packet for him. What do you think they came back with? Do you think the hiring groups were like, let's bring on this 18-year-old, this sounds amazing. No, they came back and they were like, hey, he's not qualified to be this. Now, keep in mind, by this point, Jack was actually one of the most well-known hackers in the entire United States. He'd done, I don't want to say the amount, but I'll just say it's not an insignificant amount of bounties. And was making good enough money to basically pay his way through Stanford. And they came back and they said, well, he's not qualified. He's not qualified. He should consider getting a job at either a Radio Shack or a Best Buy, or, I don't know that Radio Shack was in business. Maybe it is, I don't know. And then the other thing he should consider is getting a master's degree. Here's the thing. That's not the right place. That's not the answer. Here is an 18-year-old rocket ship becoming one of the best hackers in the country who wants to come work on the mission of national defense. I think that that's amazing. So what do? Well, we went and we literally went through every single thing. And we ended up using a hack between an HQE and an SGE. If you don't know what those are, come talk to me. But we ended up using all these, and you know what? We hired him, brought him on. Now, of course, then his pay got paid up, and it got screwed up, and he got paid for 3 months, but that's a separate story. You've been there, you work there too. But here's the thing, he did it. And he sent an email and he said, I want to come back and I want to intern again. That's amazing. They are out there. I did one last thing. I did recruiting trips. I would go to some of the top CS schools and I would just talk about some of the amazing work that we did. Be willing to talk about your story. Don't forget how compelling it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're like, oh, it's the Air Force. And we talk about it so high level. Or we say, hey, that's classified, but you can imagine it's really cool. Actually, they might not be able to. Tell your story. Go to where the talent is. Don't be afraid to go into a city where you got a lot of engineering talent and say, hey, I'm going to be out there. Reach out and say, I want to go to dinner with a few people. That's what I did. And you know what? I ended up hiring 200 or so people. You can do it.
Yeah.
I'm not telling you it's easy, though.
I would just say, part of the thing is also recognizing you may not be able to pay what a Google or a Microsoft pay, but you have a mission that we don't have, right? I worked out of college, I worked for NASA for 10 years because I was single, I didn't have a lot of expenses, and I got to work on space program stuff. I got to put communications capability in the Antarctic. I built satellite comms that fit on aircraft. That was a mission that, you don't get at a place like a Google. And so you have enormous amounts of capability. You may not be able to keep them forever, but that's okay. Getting them in, that's okay. Make it easy for them to come back and help you, right? Yeah. Either in some kind of reserve capability or in the civilian side. That kind of a vehicle to keep and recruit folks and have that kind of dynamicism is going to be really great. And you can do it.
So we are, for those involved in 16th Air Force, so Cyber Accepted Service is just kicked off. So the starting to transition, that gives us some new authorities in hiring, new incentives and kind of hiring bonuses and movement bonuses and those kind of things. Again, challenging with funding like most things are, but that has started. What I would tell you is we still have the personnel processes that are living in a 1970s personnel processes. And so what I would tell you and urge you to do is, John Nemeth, who's our career field manager, let him know we are going after those with tactical precision, because to Chris's point, you just have to take them out. It's not going to get better by working around or whatever. We've literally got to go take those things out. So we'll let you know that. I'm going to kind of twist this question a little bit because I think Scott, it's very much in your wheelhouse with the regulatory side, the industry side, the government side, but the question's really around this cybersecurity industry and community connectivity and bringing a universal framework to address APTs and criminal actors. And I mean, there's law enforcement in that, there's intelligence communities in that. We all know the need to know on the intel side. We'll say something that the intel guys will say in public, like a CrowdStrike or something like that, but then on the other side, we'll say, well, we can't even talk about that. And so whether it's a framework or how we classify or how we share, I know you dealt a lot with that with all the law enforcement and government piece. What do you see are the big kind of constraints or barriers breaking that from us being able to build a framework and actually unify? Because I think a whole of government, we've got to get there, right?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think there's some good movement. But, I sat on, as one of the founding members and sat on the board of the Retail and Hospitality ISAC. And the reason it was formed is, right, if you remember in 2014, every other week another retailer was breached, right? And so after a while, it was always like, my competitor got breached, it wasn't me. And then suddenly it kept on getting closer and closer. It's like, maybe this is a bad attitude on this. We started helping each other, and we saw how powerful that became. It was interesting because at the same time, we would go and talk to law enforcement about it, who was actively involved in the investigation, and it would be just that, give me everything that happened to you, and when we get the case done, we'll come and tell you what happened. And it's like, okay, well, at that point, I've already been breached, so, thanks, no thanks. And so, but what we have seen is, there's some good, like the NCFTA, out of Pittsburgh, and now they have an office in LA, brokers the conversation between law enforcement and private industry. And so even, I went through the FBI CISO Academy, and even there, they're saying, hey, I know sometimes you can't come directly to us, or we can't come directly to you, but we could maybe have the conversation through this third party that brokers that information. It's not perfect, right? But it's getting better, and I think that's the thing that we need to recognize is there is a lot of we've seen nation state punish private industry. It's no mystery that that's happened. And a lot of the Russian cyber criminals, Fin 7 and Fin 9, that are coming after retailers and hospitality are infiltrated with, Russian, state workers as well. And so, we still need to work on the ability to share that information. And universal frameworks and all that, they're okay, but we keep on reinventing the universal framework, so obviously there's something that's not quite there. But I do think intelligence sharing is getting better, but we've got to come up with a way that it moves faster, because to your point is machine learning becomes part of the attacks. Right. And right now a human's adapting to the attack. When a machine starts doing it for the human, boy, we better be able to react very quickly and hey, I'll get back to you in 3 months when I can declassify that information. It's just too long to wait.
Right, and I think you're going right into this next question is much discussion on how to better react and protect against threats to the DoD networks and data systems, but that's predicated on recognizing something's happening, being able to share, move that information around. And so, Janae, this may be a perfect one from a software-defined perimeter discussion is, how do we actually speed our recognition, whether that's tool or processes or workforce? How do we actually mechanize and recognize that threat against the DoD networks with better speed and precision than we've ever had before?
Yeah, so this is a critical area that's a hot topic for me. In my work with the intelligence community, have been very clear that attacks by foreign governments is overclassified. Because there's a lot of smart people in the room, so I'm going to test you by ask you to think about something. It's a little controversial, but my opinion is that when we classify a foreign attack, aren't we really helping them? Because it's kind of like backwards. What we should be classifying is American technology. We shouldn't be classifying something the Russians or Chinese do. We should be sharing it with the vendor community and asking the vendor community, what can you do in 24 hours? What can you do in 6 months? Not like sit on it for a year, which is kind of bizarre, right? And how can you ask the vendor community to respond when you classify something? So I think that entire process needs to be rebuilt. The other thing I feel strongly about is sometimes there's an attack in progress against an American company, and it gets packed away by NSA, and then somehow it goes to FBI 6 months later, and then the FBI agent shows up to tell the company that someone's exfiltrating your data. I'm like, that's so wrong. I mean, the U.S. victim should be informed immediately that this is happening to shut down their systems, right? So that needs to happen. And then in parallel to that, the security team or counterintelligence team should reach out to vendors and say, hey, this has just happened. Bring to your point, bring the smart people out, right? This is also win for the Air Force. Think about somebody young who's just joined the Air Force. Wouldn't it be exciting that you say, this just happened last night. Why did you guys work with Google? We're going to fly you out to San Jose. So then it's a new experience for them, right? And that's not happening. And I think it's unfortunate because we actually have the talent in America. There's actually nothing we can't do. So our problems right now in engaging foreign governments, I think, is completely self-inflicted. It's not like we don't have the smart people. In fact, all of the technologies used around the world were actually all invented here. And the people who invented some of them, like Milo, are still around. You can actually go talk to them, right? And that's a resource I think the Air Force really is lacking. So I think we need an open collaboration framework. I think once we have the actual attack vectors, then I feel very confident that we can respond to anything. I just do. I mean, I've been around a long time. There's nothing we didn't eventually solve. There's nothing. We solved every problem. The issue, which you've raised over, is the time to response is way too long. Doing the normal thing where you figure something out and then it goes to procurement and 2 years later, that's like silly. We should be like inverting it, saying this happened today. Who can we reach out in Silicon Valley like tomorrow and fly them out? And what can they do in 2 or 3 days? And that is something we just need to move. I just feel strongly about that, right? And there's...
Yeah, and can I just broaden this? Because part of the thing, that was in the question, how do we react to attacks against DoD networks? That's, I think, a bad
Microscopic.
Angle to look at it. DoD is now so dependent on vendors, on defense industrial base partners. If there was a buildup going on in the South China Sea, and I was China, and I wanted to kneecap that, I would go in, take out FedEx and UPS. And now you're left with Mil-Air. How's that going to work for you? Or what if I decide I'm going to go take out the power grid that powers a section of the bases out here, and now I'm forcing everybody to run on emergency power? Do you do week-long tests where you're running on emergency power for a week? Does anybody do that? So you are way dependent on a whole set of industries. And in some ways, you need to protect those things as well. And not recognizing those dependencies is going to lead you to a false sense of security, because no piece of infrastructure is off limits in the cyberspace. In the world of physical attack, if a foreign power dropped a bomb on a substation in Virginia, that would be tantamount to war. But you know what? That happens all the time in cyberspace today, and we have accepted that as the norm. We don't treat that as sort of a declaration of war. And so that environment where your vendors and the rest are also in with you, you've got to think about it that way. And I'll say one other thing. The DoD thinks about protecting information in its own domain, but that information, increasingly, the most classified information is shared with vendors, right? You guys use less technology to protect some of your most classified data than Netflix uses to protect episodes of The Simpsons. I'm serious. Every time an episode of The Simpsons is watched, Netflix knows whether or not you're authorized, if you want to download it, how long are you able to keep it, can you make copies of it? All of that is built in to the technology we use to protect movies. But when you give a piece of SAP data to a contractor, how do you know that it's being protected? Where's the digital supply chain trace that occurs? You depend on people to do that. I don't understand how that's a good idea, right? So we need to be thinking more broadly, right, about how to protect the underlying pieces of information. We have technology that's available to do that, but it's not being used in this domain.
Well, I think it goes into the next question of, I think there's going to be a thematic, at least this morning, and Wedge started this, on diversity of thought in this space, right? We have built this network perimeter model, and we've trained our airmen for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And so the attack vector is going to change. IoT is going to drive a change. Mobile, hyperconnectivity, quantum. And so this really question goes back to the diversity in the workforce piece. I do want to dig in a little bit more too, because I think it's there was a YouTube video, I don't know, 6 months ago, and it was like, I want to kill a mosquito swarm. And this hacker basically said, well, I can visually relocate the lasers and take these and burn the wings off of a mosquito. And you're like, one is, why would anybody do that? That's kind of like over, but the whole concept behind it was like, think differently about because we can,
right.
But it also forces us to look at the problem different.
Right.
Right, and so if we keep coming in from this network-centric model, and so the question around is diversity in workforce, and where do you see the opportunities there to drive that diversity of thought with respect to cybersecurity?
Can I just, I'll start off. We did a program at DDS that was paired with incredibly talented software engineers who wore a uniform, right? They might be officers, they might be enlisted, doesn't really matter to us. but they were software engineers in uniform, and we would build capabilities. There's a really cool Wired article about one of the things we did. We built a piece of hardware to help take down drones that had been weaponized, and did it very, very fast. And I loved that. Here we took incredibly talented people in uniform who were software engineers. They may not be software engineers in the military, though. They may have other jobs, right? And we would take them and we'd put them around a bunch of nerds that we hired, and they were allowed to do nerd things, and they were allowed to like really build things. That was amazing. That experience, then pairing it with the people who had the mission, saying, hey, what's the problem, is really important. And I'm gonna I just want to, the only reason I wanted to state this is just to leave one thought there. Focus on the problem, not the solution. When you hire incredibly talented people, they don't need you to give them the solution. They need to get the problem. And it's funny how often we miss that. Engineers in today's marketplaces is a completely different world than it was 20 years ago, right? 20, 30 years ago, it was a completely different world. The career paths of incredibly talented technical people were different. We just live in a different marketplace. They have the ability to go and solve really hard problems. But what I have seen over and over is that we hinder the teams like that by offering the solution. I brought on a team of really, one of these talented engineering teams. A bunch of people in uniform. The first thing, they showed up to the DDS offices. The first thing that they asked for, they were like, we need a really big computer with like 16 cores and 64 gigs of RAM. I was like, what's that? I was like, why not use, I don't know, the internet with unlimited cores and unlimited RAM? And they were like, well, but we need a thing to run it on because that's not secure. I'm like, well, who told you that? We had to like tease apart all these things that had been learned. All these things, they prevent us from actually looking at a problem in a new way because they define the constraints that we start with. That's why you got to hire people who are current and technical. That's why you pair them with people who are there or who are on the mission. And that is why you give them the problem, because you yourself, myself included, are often defined by the boundaries and the barriers that we have been working within. It's just a fact. Milo started talking about this thing called Conway's Law, which basically says that organizations build out processes and do things in the way that they are defined themselves. There's no better place. You said it yourself. Hey, nobody would organize it the way that we do here, right? That's Conway's Law. So look at ways to break that.
Yes. Well, my funny story in the building is records management, right? The most compliance-based thing, and you come into things like Office 365 and how you can reimagine how you do records management. You go, well, that's not the way. No, it's not against the intent of the law. It just hasn't been how we've done it for the last 25 years, where we mechanized file folders into shared drives, right? And a very simple example, but we got, Scott, you were talking a little bit about diversity earlier, but I'm not sure we pulled that thread. How did you make that paradigm shift where you were able to bring in not just network perimeter folks? I mean, was there any tips or tricks or lessons learned from that?
Yeah, I would say, back to like play days and seeing new technology and all that. I went out to a big identity provider in Silicon Valley that provides identity in the cloud. And I was like, okay, I need to see your security architecture, just make sure it's all good and all that. And they were all cloud-based. And so I'm like, where are the firewalls? And like they had to explain it to me like 3 or 4 times. I felt like an idiot. Like, I don't even get what you're showing me. And then once I saw it, it's like, oh, wow, that's like super cool and genius, right?
Elegant.
But like, why didn't I think of that, right? And so in being at another firewall manufacturer on their advisory board, everybody got wrapped up in PCAP, like, should the firewall still capture PCAP? And it's like once the packet leaves my network and it goes to, let's say, Workday, there's another API that I don't even know if I had the IP address, who cares? Like, I wouldn't even know what it does, right? And so I think that's the thing is you do have to, you know, I'm a Gen Xer, hardcore Gen Xer. You know, we hate millennials. We're the get off the lawn generation, right? But they're super smart. They just work differently, right? And in fact, I would argue that my 17-year-old is 1,000 times smarter than I was at her age. She drives me crazy the way she works because I'm used to this paradigm, right? And so I think you've got to break out of your comfort zone and go hang out with people that you're not comfortable with. And, you know, to your point, see what they're doing. And you know, I'm finding it, now it's funny, you know, going from MGM to a security company, we're facing a lot of the same challenge of like, well, we can't put that information in the cloud because it's like our secret sauce. And it's like, if we can't secure the cloud, like who else is going to do it? So, you know, like we better catch up to that paradigm super quickly.
You got this.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, like,
We would never
in-
do that, but we need you to do that.
Yeah, you need to go into the, you know, universities and stuff like that and see what the kids are playing with, because that's, you know, what is consumer grade technology now. You know, this is where the paradigm is flipped. It used to be, it was really cool when you worked in the technology field because you got technology that hadn't caught up to the consumer space. It's totally slipped.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, why is this technology that you're providing me crappy? I get better technology at home. That's what I want.
Yeah.
And you know, when 5G is a nationwide reality, who cares about anything being connected to them? You're going to have connectivity everywhere, so they won't be in your building. They will be in a plane or a car or their vacation home, and that's how you better view the network. You know, Microsoft doesn't have an internal network anymore. Okta doesn't have an internal network. You better get used to that.
Yeah.
So we got a couple minutes left, just a minute or two if you have any closing thoughts for the, really appreciate everybody coming out today, but if you had a 1 minute closing, anything you'd like to kind of leave the group with?
Well, I'd actually wanted to build on Chris's story about hiring a kid. I think the systems are so complex as we head into them. They're really distributed computing. There's, to me, the notion of here's the cloud, here's the network, is actually kind of artificial because we have software stacks which are communicating all the logic between them. And I think, you know, from an Air Force and DoD perspective, we're going to have to hire kids who really love this stuff, right? Because you can't force someone to learn this. You can't present, I know in the first session there was a talk about a career track, right? But even, and I understand you should have a career track, but you can't kind of force it. You actually have to flip the model a little bit and hire people who really love it and want to do it every day. And that's a little bit hard in a military thing, but it's possible, right? And you have to give the younger people the opportunity to work with vendors, to get out of the base, make it exciting. What was said before, give them the problem, don't give them a solution. Yep. Say, here's the problem, and you can use any technology in the Air Force, but even outside the Air Force. You are free to go. And I think we need that cultural shift. And then the other part of that is we need a cultural shift between the Air Force and the vendors. I think this, I think it's great we're going to the OTA model, which is really going to help stuff, but I think that's just the beginning. Because the OTA assumes you know what you want to OTA. We're working on a whole set of problems like quantum safe security, distributed computing, IoT, where I bet nobody even knows what to OTA, right? So we need the ability to have that collaboration so we can figure out what to do as a group. And I mean, I think this is doable. It's going to be very difficult organizationally, but I think that's what we need to do. And I think if we can do it, you know, we can handle anything.
Yeah, I would say, you know, back to the diversity thing, tell people what you do. You know, within the limit, you know, I actually, David Singer wrote a great book. It's called The Perfect Weapon. It's a great primer for anybody who's never, like, what is cybersecurity? And you know, like, tell people what you do. And it's, you know, I've gotten more people to come over to, like, it's actually a lot of fun. If you're big into problem solving, you know, it's always changing, and go seek those people out and bring them into the industry. We shouldn't have a shortage, right? We should have too many people wanting to get into the industry. And so I think evangelizing what you do in the mission and all that, there's a lot of people that if they understood it better, I think would come over and help out.
Chris?
I'll just close with a list of a few things that I think are maybe helpful, at least they were for me on getting DDS to grow up. One, I like starting with things that are very small and getting quick wins. We didn't start with Jedi. I think we would have been crushed, or it would have never happened if we tried to do it at the beginning. And maybe just to make that point a little bit more, on day one when I started, I listed out, hey, what would we like to do here? And one of those was, hey, what if we did a commercial cloud for all DoD? But we just didn't know anything about it. So start small, get wins, learn what you're doing. Take those wins and then use them to go after bigger things. Build a team that is absolutely incredibly competent. Milo said that. Competency wins. Delivery wins. Delivery is the superpower. Having competency will get people to believe that even if you're dressed like this, that they'll actually listen to you, right? I had somebody in the DoD once say, hey, despite how you're dressed, you're actually very professional. So that was good. And then 3, build out the coalition of the willing. You can't do it yourself. So the coalition of the willing are going to be the groups that are around you that ultimately you do have to build bridges in. I want to be very careful. I'm not saying work everything within the process and try to be a diplomat to do it the way that things are. That will not work. It will not work, because the last point is change is hard. Change is uncomfortable, and because of that, you want to find the coalition of the willing, the people who will step in, who will actually go to the plate at the time that you need it, at the time you need it most, and you can pull those levers in order to get something that feels extraordinary at the time, that if everybody comes through and it's a win, they will actually deeply appreciate because they were part of that. But change is hard. I think that everything we're talking about here is very, very difficult because we're looking at great power competition and we're looking at, you know, authoritarian capitalistic regimes, right? Those are different things. New approaches, new challenges. How exciting, but it's going to be hard. So that's where I'd close.
Okay, thanks. I would say a few things. One, everything you're building today is a software system. So you need to recognize that software's never done. Software ages badly. You have to be thinking about it like it was a set of code. And you know, modern software development means you're going to need to be able to push things out quickly. And by the way, when you push things out quickly, you need to build in the capability and test, being able to revert quickly. We make mistakes all the time at Google. We have the really, really good engineers. We have great test harnesses. Sometimes we screw up. We push an update out to 1 or 2% of the user base, and oh, something bad happened. So there's a revert button. We have the revert button on our network. We make changes, you add a link, you can revert and back that change out. If you have the capability to revert and you're sure it works because you exercise it all the time, you can have the ability to make changes much more aggressively and have confidence. 2, I think, don't accept nonsense. You know, when base housing has faster communication speeds than your operations center, there's a problem. That should just not be okay. Right? And so connectivity is the oxygen of compute. If you don't have bandwidth, and you don't have the ability to be flexible and quickly deploy and utilize it, it's going to make everything slower. I was in a conversation with an F-35 non-advocacy review, and somebody said, well, we have to the son of Alice, or maybe not son, the future Alice Next, well, it's got to be able to operate over 1 megabit links because that's what aircraft carriers have. Well, that's ridiculous. You're going to cripple the entire architecture of this new system for logistics because aircraft carriers have a fraction of the connectivity a cruise ship does. Well, that's not okay, right? Why should the Air Force logistics of the F-35 be crippled because the Navy can't figure out how to put modern connectivity into a carrier task group? Well, understand what trade-offs you're making, right? Don't accept that. We don't have to anymore, right? And then lastly, I would just say this notion of you have to protect information, not protect the network. The network is a tool, not an end in itself. If you've got devices that you're putting on the end and you say, Milo, there's no way I could make a PC be safe enough to put on the internet. Well, maybe you shouldn't use a PC. Maybe it's an iPad. Maybe it's a Chromebook. Whatever you're doing, you should be using a web interface to it. Because at least there, you've got the ability to rapidly swap out crypto. Because guess what? All the cryptography that we think is solid today, in the future is not going to be. So if you can't swap all the crypto out in all your software, when there's a hole that's discovered, or the compute gets fast enough, or quantum annealing gets to the place where we can now break that, well, that's kind of a problem. And by the way, you shouldn't wait until crypto is broken, because you might worry about people storing stuff and then being able to break it later. So be ahead of that. And I would just say in the end, the Air Force is doing a lot of great things. Bill, your leadership and the Chief of Staff and Will Roper and you guys are really, I think, understanding that the status quo has to change. And we deal in my Pentagon volunteer hat, deal with a lot of different teams, and I'm really encouraged by what the Air Force is doing. So, the question is, I think you're moving in the right direction, and how do you get more momentum behind that? Right. Because there's a risk. You might not win a war.
That's a great, as we close, all of you are part of that momentum, right, of whether that's accelerating, decelerating, or staying at the same speed. So that would be my final one is thanks to AFCEA for this forum. As Vanessa talked about, really the heart and passion of all of us should be our future workforce. And so putting money back into STEM and putting that investment there is really key. I also want to thank the Broadmoor. I appreciate all the free, monogrammed, towels and all that stuff with the B on it. Really cool stuff. I never expected that to have all this monogram goods, but
so good.
I think y'all got the same. But
I got your monogram stuff too.
Yeah, mine was a mistake. Yeah.
But as we wrap up, hopefully this was beneficial. Some of the thematics that we're doing inside the Air Force are actually embedded across all these lanes. And so as Milo said it well, be part of the change, be part of the transformation. Our airmen demand it, our airmen deserve it, and that's really why you're here, and driving a better secure, but a better capable Air Force for our airmen. So with that, thank you all, and big hands to our esteemed panelists.
Sir, on behalf of the chapter, I'd like to thank you guys for spending your time with us here today. And in addition to all the monogram stuff, we do have some parting gifts for you and your panel. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Thank you. Okay, we're going to take a quick break at this point while we reset the stage for our next speaker. Please be back at 11:15 for Mr. Jesse Goldhammer. Thank you.